Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this FOBLAP event on Watershed Action Plans 5 years in. Thank you for attending. I'm just going to do a couple of logistics and then we'll get going. Just a reminder to please keep yourself muted while the speakers are speaking. If you have a question or want to make a comment, you can put those in the chat. And then you can also use the raised hand little symbol if you want to ask your question. And I just put that on the screen. If you don't know where it is, it's down in the reaction section. And you can just raise your hand and show that. I also would like to remind you that at the end of this meeting, there will be an exit survey. So when you click leave meeting, wait a second and it will pop up. It'll just take a minute to fill it out, but we really appreciate it if you will fill that out and give us some thoughts on what you thought of this event and ideas for future events. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jack Widnes. Jack is the chair of the FOBLAP AIS Water Quality Committee, and he's going to say a few words to introduce our program. So
Thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for coming. Today is a very important and a very special meeting. And why do I say that? Well, we're dealing with a very important topic because, you know, they're not making any more Lake St. Catharines. They're not making any more Lake Iroquois. They're not making any more Lake Rapondas. We have to take care of the lakes. We won't have new lakes that we can go to. So that's very important. I'd like to thank our two committees for putting together today's meeting and tell you that today is going to be important in covering the points that you'll need for considering setting up a watershed action plan. We're going to have an overview and history that's going to help set the stage. And perhaps, as many of you know, phosphorus has been a major concern in our lakes. In the last 20 or 30 years, there's good evidence that phosphorus levels are increasing. And phosphorus are important in terms of the development of algae and interfering with the lake processes. This is particularly important in those of you on mesotrophic and oligotrophic lakes, and we'll be hearing more about that later. We'll also be talking about how to help start you with the planning of a watershed plan, and then the funding of such plans. Then we're going to have perspectives as the last three presentations from the Conservation District standpoint, from the standpoint of those who are in the process of creating how to create a watershed action plan, and those that have done this, so that you have those experiences to look to. So I hope you'll all look at this very carefully today and enjoy what we have to say. We have a lot of important things to your lake, and I'm glad we have so many of you activists here to listen and to hopefully consider starting your own watershed action plan. So I'll now pass this over to Dave Johnson for beginning with the speakers. Dave?
Yes, thank you, Jack. So first speaker on the agenda is Allison Marchioni. She is the environmental scientist in the Lakes and Ponds program for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And many of you know her for her role in the Lakewise program, but she also oversees the Watershed Action Plan strategy for the state. And she'll be talking about that strategy in this overview.
All right.
Go ahead, Allison.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and go to full screen. All right. You see that full size? Great. All right. So good morning, everyone. As Dave said, my name is Allison Marchioni. I'm a shoreland restoration ecologist for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Thank you all for having me here today. And Jack gave a really good explanation of the why, right? Why are we here? It's all about water quality and protecting Vermont's beautiful lakes. So a little overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm talking about Lake Watershed Action Plans, sort of an overview of what they are, why we do them, how we decide where to do them, and sort of what the point of all of this work is. So I'm trying to leave a lot of room for questions at the end, but also if anyone has a burning question during the presentation, you can interrupt me with that. So getting right into it. What is a Lake Watershed Action Plan? Lake Watershed Action Plans are assessment and planning tools. And the goal of these assessment and planning tools is to identify the greatest threats to the health of the lake coming from the shore of the lake. So mostly what we're talking about here is nutrient pollution. Again, as Jack suggested, we're looking a lot at phosphorus. Phosphorus is the limiting nutrient within an aquatic system. It's what all of the plant life needs to grow and thrive in a lake system. And when I say plant life, that does include algae. And too much phosphorus can lead to overgrowth of plants and overgrowth of algae. All those plants are using oxygen in the water. So the more plants, the less oxygen is available for other living things like macroinvertebrates or fish. And you kind of get into this feedback loop with too much phosphorus where you're lowering the quality of your water. So that's mostly what we're looking at when it comes to nutrient pollution. There are also some other things, including like chlorides and salts from roads that can be getting into the water from sort of the surrounding land. And what we're looking at when we're looking at these sources of pollution from the land, we're trying to answer two questions. What are the sources of nutrient pollution into the lake, and what can we do about them? So the end product of a Lake Watershed Action Plan is a plan that identifies the problem areas, identifies the possible solutions to those problems, and then prioritizes those solutions using a series of factors. And then you end up in the end with a list of potentially implementable projects that will increase the health of the lake. So really sort of the end point of a Lake Watershed Action Plan is a plan of projects that can be implemented for lake health. So why are we doing this? Well, we know that Vermont's lake shores are highly developed. Prior to 2014 and the implementation of the Shoreline Protection Act, there was really no statewide regulation about development on our lake shores, which led to a lot of development on our lake shores. Our lakes are more densely developed than most of our urban areas. And it also led to some pretty poor development of those lake shores. So things like development right next to the water, lawns all the way down to the lake, roads right along the side of a lake shore. That's sort of what we've all inherited here, right? And so we know that Vermont's lakes are highly developed, and we know that they're poorly developed, with Vermont's lakes being measured below the national average for the health of our shoreland by the EPA. We also know that a lot of development correlates very strongly with pollution into water bodies. So we've got these highly developed, somewhat poorly developed lake shores, and we know that that correlates very strongly with nutrient pollution into the lakes. And finally, we know that when a lake's natural vegetation is removed for development, that wildlife habitat degrades, the shores erode, and nutrient loading into lakes increases. So we are going to talk a lot about phosphorus today, but I also want to point out that restoring our lakes to a more natural state also really helps us to increase and protect wildlife habitat, which helps to sustain birds and insects, and fish need insects, and there's a whole ecosystem out there that we're trying to protect. So while we are going to talk a lot about like the chemistry of lake science, there is also this sort of softer side of it with habitat creation and protection. So we're looking at the whole watershed, right? We're not just looking at the water quality or the shoreline, but the whole watershed. And for anyone who doesn't know, a watershed is all the land that drains into a common body of water. So all of the streams, all of the roads, everything that's draining into an area, a body of water. In this case, we're talking about lakes. And up there on the right, you can see a little picture of Coles Pond in Jamaica, Vermont. And that little blue outline around the lake is all of the land area that's draining into that lake. So your watershed might be bigger than you're imagining it to be. in some cases very big. And everything that's happening in that watershed is affecting the water quality of that endpoint body of water. So the Lake Watershed Action Plan is a whole watershed approach. We're looking at that whole area. It's a much more holistic approach to water quality management that allows us to look for sources of nutrients beyond right around the lake. Not to say that right around the lake doesn't have an effect, because it definitely does, but there are also potential impacts further upstream or further away from the lake. So when doing a Lake Watershed Action Plan, we're looking at 3 key areas of assessment. These are shoreland, roads, and streams. The shoreland assessments are really looking at areas of erosion. Those are usually due to those poor shoreland development practices, and that are very close to the lake edge, and also that remove some of that important vegetation around the lakeshore. Through roads, we're looking at stormwater runoff from roadways that can add pollution and sediments into the lakes. So that's your hydrologically connected roads that are all sort of running towards the lake. And also, like I mentioned before, many roads are built right along the edges of lake shores, and those can be very prone to undercutting and prone to erosion, and often are contributing to some of that lack of vegetation. And finally, we have streams. Streams can be assessed to look for erosion that's further inland from the lakes. Those can be due to forestry practices, it can be due to agricultural practices, it could be other factors that are causing sediments to enter the streams and flow down towards the lakes. And I did include a link on the bottom of this slide, and my slides will be available for you after this presentation. This link here goes to the technical guidance from Vermont DEC on how to perform a Lake Watershed Action Plan. So if anybody really wants to get into the nitty-gritty of how these are done, you can peruse that document to see what our guidance is. All right, how are we determining where Lake Watershed Action Plans are going to take place? At Vermont DEC Lakes and Ponds, when we are looking at all the lakes in Vermont and deciding where we think LWAPs would be appropriate, we're looking at 3 main characteristics. We're looking for significantly increasing phosphorus trends, either in the spring or summer phosphorus data that we collect. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We're also looking for disturbed watersheds. So as I mentioned, our assessments are looking at lake shores, roads, and streams. And if a watershed does not have, 1 or 2 of those, like say it's doesn't have a lot of development along its lake shores, or it doesn't have any roads. I mean, there are lakes in Vermont, even though a lot of our lakes are overly developed, there are some that are very remote that don't have a lot of development around them. They might not be appropriate locations to do a Lake Watershed Action Plan because they don't contain the elements of our assessment. So we wouldn't really have anything to assess. And I would say most lakes that have development in Vermont are going to be considered at least moderately disturbed watersheds. And remember, it's not just what's going on right around the lake, it's also what's going on in the entire watershed. So disturbance away from the lake may be what's getting that disturbed watershed score. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we're looking for lakes that have active and engaged lake associations or other user groups. We have found through doing these for the past, 6 years, that having a very engaged lake association or other type of user or owner association for a lake that is enthusiastic about doing a Lake Watershed Action Plan and who is excited to partner with DEC or with the contractors doing this work is invaluable, because there's so much local knowledge and history to many of these lakes and lake communities that we just couldn't possibly know, coming from outside. And so having a lake association that is really excited and interested in doing these projects has been hugely helpful and leads to much better outcomes. So that is one of our key important factors in deciding where Lake Watershed Action Plans will happen. There are a couple of different funding sources for Lake Watershed Action Plans, and DEC Lakes and Ponds is one of them. But all 3 of the funding sources for Lake Watershed Action Plans in Vermont have some sort of geographical restriction. So for example, the Lake Champlain Basin Program funds Lake Watershed Action Plans, but of course only in the Lake Champlain Basin. the clean water service providers, which is a whole other thing, and I'm sure we're going to get into funding a lot more later, but they are also region specific, but can also fund Lake Watershed Action Plans. Those only exist within the Lake Champlain Basin and the Memphremagog Basin right now. So those two areas are sort of covered by clean water service providers. So because of those other funding entities within the Champlain and Memphremagog basins, DEC Lakes and Ponds has been prioritizing work outside of the Champlain and Memphremagog basin just to kind of make things a little more even, I guess, is how I would best put it. That doesn't mean that we don't fund projects and Lake Watershed Action Plans within the Champlain or Memphremagog basin. In fact, last year we funded the Echo Seymour Lake Watershed Action Plan, which is in the Memphremagog basin, because it was a high priority project for DEC Lakes and Ponds to have that achieved. So we prioritize, but we're not necessarily super strict about it. So just, we'll talk about funding a lot more later, but just a little overview of the geographic restrictions. So I got some questions in a recent talk about Lake Watershed Action Plans, about how we decide where to do them. And so I just wanted to display some of that scorecard data and talk about it really briefly. Anyone who's interested in learning more about how lakes are scored, this is another actual live link down here at the bottom, learn how lakes are scored. So you can get that from this presentation. Or if you just go to any of the scorecard data, that same link is at the bottom of the scorecard. So you can learn how all of these things are scored. Again, if you really want to dive into sort of the math behind all of this. But so this is the lake scorecard for Lake Eden. And when the Lake Eden LWAP was sort of starting, the community had a lot of concerns over the increased sediment and phosphorus levels in the lake. Those were sort of the main drivers of creating the Lake Watershed Action Plan there. And I wanted to talk specifically about this watershed score because I did have some questions about how that is decided. So the watershed disturbance score is derived from a landscape development intensity index. And that landscape development intensity index is a measure of all of the human-induced alterations to the biological, chemical, and physical processes of a watershed's land that is impacting the receiving water. I know I already said this, but I'm just reiterating it again. There's a lot of math included in how this is all calculated and how you end up with a moderately disturbed or disturbed score. So again, check out this Learn How Lakes Are Scored section. But you can also see here, we've got the moderately disturbed watershed, we've got stressed water quality standards, and those water quality standards are sort of exemplified in the circle at the top here, which shows that there is a fair water quality trend and a fair shoreland condition. All of these elements together, plus active folks at Lake Eden who were interested in pursuing a Lake Watershed Action Plan, meant that Lake Eden was a very good candidate for these Lake Watershed Action Plans. And diving a little bit into the water quality, not too much here, but you can see they had a highly significantly increasing summer phosphorus trend that helped to drive that decision. And again, all of these metrics are explained in that how to interpret the Lake Watershed Action Score information, and I can also maybe answer questions about them, but you can see spring phosphorus and summer phosphorus, as well as Secchi disk transparency, which is a measure of the water quality and clarity, and also the chlorophyll, which is a good approximation for the algae abundance within the lake. So we look at all of this data when determining where we think OWAPs would be most beneficial. So where have they been completed to date? We have 5 completed Lake Watershed Action Plans across the state. The first Lake Watershed Action Plan was at Lake Eden. It began in 2018 and was completed in 2019 and done by the Lamoille County Conservation District with Fitzgerald Environmental. Lake Elmore followed shortly after that, done by the same folks in 2020. The Lake Dunmore Association funded their own Lake Watershed Action Plan at Lake Dunmore, which was completed in 2021. And then last year, Maidstone Lake and Lake Fairley also completed their Lake Watershed Action Plans. Those were done by the Essex County NRCD and Stone Environmental at Maidstone, and the White River NRCD and Bear Creek Environmental at Lake Fairley. And all of these, except for Lake Dunmore, were funded through Vermont DEC. So these are our completed OWAPs to date. Only 5, it's only been 6 years. However, this is the list of currently happening Lake Watershed Action Plans. So we've got a whole slew of these that are going to be finished in 2024, including LWAPs at Caspian Lake, Lake Willoughby, Shadow Lake and Glover, Lake Morey, Woodford Pond, Halls Lake, Echo and Seymour, which again there are 2 lakes within one watershed. The Seymour Lake is entirely within the Echo Lake watershed. Lake Iroquois, Lake St. Catherine, Fairfield Pond, and Keeler Bay. So those should all be completed this year. And then a couple more beginning in 2024. We have Lake Bomazene, Little and Great Averill, which again are in the same watershed, and Miles Pond. So there's a lot happening throughout the state at all of these various lakes. These are all done by a slew of different partners. I won't get too much into that, or I'd spend a lot of time naming everybody who's working on these. And then who's funding all of this work? Well, as I mentioned before, there are sort of 4 funding sources within the state that have been used for Lake Watershed Action Plans. So the first one of those is DEC enhancement money. That is money that comes directly to DEC lakes and ponds. And then we, using our prioritization process, will determine where we think that money will be best spent. We put out an RFP and get proposals back. And we have funded Lake Watershed Action Plans that way at Eden, Elmore, Maidstone, Fairleigh, Willoughby, Morey, Shadow Halls, Woodford, Echo and Seymour, Little and Great Averill, and Miles Pond. The Lake Champlain Basin Program also has funded LWAPs in the past, including Fairfield Pond, Keeler Bay, Caspian, Iroquois, and St. Catherine. As I mentioned before, Lake Dunmore funded their own Lake Watershed Action Plan. They really took the initiative on that one. And that worked out really well. They used our technical guidance and hired Fitzgerald Environmental, who had already performed, the first LWAPs in Vermont. So they were set up for success in that way. And finally, as I mentioned, there are clean water service providers, and clean water service providers can fund Lake Watershed Action Plans and other assessment work. And last year, the first Lake Watershed Action Plan was funded through a clean water service provider. That South Lake Quist funded the Lake Bomazene LWAP, which will be getting started, I think, this spring. So it's really great to see the clean water service providers using their assessment funds to fund Lake Watershed Action Plans. I would love to see more of those. And I will say DEC Lakes and Ponds is a little different from the other funding sources in that we decide where we think that the LWAPs should be taking place and put out RFPs that way. The Lake Champlain Basin Fund and the Clean Water Service Providers both accept applications for funding. So lake associations can apply for that kind of funding that way. And we might have slightly different requirements or criteria when looking at those applications. They might have different requirements than DEC. But again, I think we have some folks on the call who are going to be talking more about funding later. So this is just a really quick overview of sort of where all this money is coming from. So what are the outcomes of a Lake Watershed Action Plan? As I mentioned earlier, the outcomes are a prioritized list of projects that will address inputs of nutrients into the lake. And those projects are prioritized using a custom prioritization matrix. The prioritization matrix is made by the consultant in conjunction with community stakeholders to make sure that the projects include a reflection of the priorities of the community. And then a handful of those prioritized projects, usually the top prioritized projects, are selected to move on to 30% design by stakeholders. And I know that 30% design is a term that can throw people off if you don't frequently work with engineers. You can think of this as just sort of a conceptual design or even like a rough draft design. It's not a completed design. That would be called 100% design. So 30%, it's like 30% done. And those 30% designs are really important because it puts them into the next phase of sort of design and implementation when we're talking about funding and we're talking about, showing the community what we're proposing to do at a site. But I also want to stress that the prioritized list of projects is equally important because as time goes on, someone can pick up that list, apply for funding, and start to implement more of those projects. And often, there's already been some level of communication with landowners and some level of buy-in from them. So I don't want to put all of the burden of the LWAP on the 30% design. that prioritized list of projects is also really important. And so speaking of prioritization, what does that mean and how are we doing it? The prioritization is looking at the benefit that the proposed project will have from several different angles. So typically we look at water quality benefits like phosphorus reduction, sediment retention, and others. Then we also look at sort of how feasible the project is by looking at, how does the owner of the land feel about the project? I'll say all the projects that come out of Lake Watershed action plans are voluntary. So no landowner is being forced into doing any projects on private land. It's, all of this is just sort of ideas until people agree to them. We also look at the cost of projects because, we don't want to do super high cost projects for little reward, right? That's sort of how we're deciding where those high priority projects are. And we also look into things like the operation and maintenance of a project and how difficult that will be and what the lifespan of a project might be. And then finally, we look at the co-benefits, which can be things like fixing a chronic problem area, reducing flood risk, doing projects in highly visible areas that might be educational, or increasing habitat and preserving natural communities. And the co-benefits is really the area where the community has the biggest influence on the prioritization process. The first few things that are listed here are things pretty much every prioritization process is going to look at, how impactful is the project? How much does it cost? Can we actually do it? But the co-benefits can be an area of bigger influence in the prioritization process for the community. And this section of the prioritization matrix is sort of what fluctuates the most from LWAP to LWAP, depending on the needs of the specific lake community. I wanted to show you just an example of what these prioritization matrices can look like. So this is a prioritization table from the Willoughby LWAP. And it only shows a very small amount of the spreadsheet because if I had included all of the columns, it would have been very small. But this is just to give you an idea of sort of what these outcomes look like. So at Willoughby, 75 projects were identified and the LWAP team evaluated each potential project and assigned a ranking that reflects the assumed potential water quality benefits. Then they took the top 30 projects from those 75 and they made project scoping sheets. And from those 30 project scoping sheets that ended up being in this table, as well as on the sheets, they selected 5 for 30% designs. So I wanted to show an example of this table because this is the to-do list that I'm talking about. Like not all of these, obviously only 5 out of 30 were selected to move on to the 30% design stage, but there are still a lot of really good and impactful projects in this list. To give an example of what the project sheets or problem area summaries look like, this is an example from the Eden LWAP. And so in this particular site, it was, well, actually I'll talk about the suggestions later, but you can see, the top section here has sort of the basics of the project area. This is the Eden recreation area in the town of Eden. This is how large the drainage area is, all that information. It gives a site description of the site as it existed at the time of the assessment, a couple photos, and then a description of the BMP. BMP means best management practice. And in this case, it was a buffer planting and some infiltration basins and along the shoreline. And then it gives sort of this is a best guess of what sort of some of this stuff was going to be that would later get, when it went to 30% design, get more detailed. So, and then this is what a 30% design looks like. And again, I'm just showing you guys these things like the sheet and the prioritization table and the 30% design, just so you can have an idea in your head about what these things are and what they look like while we're talking about them today. So, and I don't want to steal, I think Peter's talking later about some of the LWAP implementation. So I don't want to steal his thunder by getting too much into these projects, but I did just want to show one example. So in this project, you can see outlined in orange here is the drainage area. The red lines are culverts that were already existing. And what was suggested here is a grassline pretreatment swale, a bioretention basin, and another swale as an outlet right here by the town beach. What was happening was a lot of stormwater was running over this gravel parking lot, and there was nothing between the gravel parking lot here and the lakeshore here to kind of catch that water and filter it for sediment. So the idea here was to put something here to do that. And so this is what I mean, 30% design. It's pretty basic, just to give everyone an idea of what we're suggesting here. And then this project was implemented last summer. This was it when it was in the process, and this was it when it was completed. So you've got your swales and your catchment basins, and it looks really nice and pretty and is stopping all of the sediment from the parking lot from just going right towards the beach. This was a really great project, and it was really fun to see it implemented last year. So final question for this presentation is sort of who performs all of this work. I've already mentioned a couple of entities that have performed LWAPs in the past, but generally projects like watershed action plans are put out to bid depending on the funding source. And then those doing the actual work on the ground, like it's not me, I'm not out there doing, you know, road assessments and stream assessments. These are all put out to bid and go, the contracts and grants are awarded to natural resource conservation districts often, or environmental contracting firms, or other watershed groups. There are a couple of groups in Vermont that don't fall into either of those categories, but do a lot of really great water quality work and also can hold these grants. And then finally, so the role of DEC generally is technical guidance and sort of oversight of these projects. That's my role in all of this, is to offer assistance and guidance on these projects and help them come to fruition. And I love working on them. I think LWAPs are a really great tool for Vermont to protect our water quality. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. My slides will be available for you all after today's presentation. And if anyone has questions later that they think of and want to shoot me an email, I'm more than happy to answer questions that way as well. So thank you.
I think we have a question from Carolyn Foley. Carolyn, did you want to say your question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess one of my questions was, are the 30% designs that come out of an LWAP, are they beholden to all the same milestones and deliverables that are laid out in Appendix B of the QUIP funding policy for standalone 30% designs? Because I know Appendix B is something that the basin planners have been really encouraging us to adhere to. And I know 30% designs are their own type of project type that have, you know, VDH peer review, staff engagement, all of that good stuff. So I guess, are the 30% designs that come with an LWAP, are they also, do you have to meet all those same deliverables and milestones?
Yes. If the LWAP is funded through DEC, meaning through the enhancement money that Lakes and Ponds has, or through a QUISP, then yes, the 30% designs will have to adhere. It'll be written into the contract that all of those milestones and deliverables will be included in the milestones and deliverable table. If it's funded through LCBP, I believe the answer is no. But if you want to apply for 100% design or implementation funding from DEC or the QUISPs, I think that things like VDH peer review will already have to have been done before you can get that funding. So I think it makes sense to like double check if you're planning on applying for money through DEC for implementation to make sure you have all of those deliverables.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And then I hope I don't butcher this. Otoquichi, would you like to say your question?
Sure. And you were spot on. It's Otoquichi. Good job.
Wow.
I don't know if my question is a little too granular, Allison, but I was just curious in that last project that you showed the slides of the vegetated swale capturing gravel runoff, storm runoff, washing gravel into the vegetated swale rather than into the lake. I was just wondering who ended up doing the maintenance for that and what kind of maintenance is involved. But that can be a I have a state park I wanted to talk to you about at some point.
Well, we should definitely talk. I think
Okay.
That's town property, but I think Peter's on this call and probably knows exactly what the answer is.
Okay. I don't want to get into the weeds if that's going to get touched on later or should get touched on separately. That's fine.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the answer off the top
Okay.
of my head for that, but I'm sure that somebody is.
This is Evan, we're going to talk about that project a little bit too. Hopefully
Super.
we won't overlap too much with Peter, but we're just mostly going to talk about the design. But you're
Super.
correct, Allison. It's on town property.
Mhm.
And so the town, I believe, is responsible for maintaining that over
Okay.
time.
Thank you.
And Dave Johnson, you had a good question.
Yes, Allison, could you describe the Lake Watershed Action Plan database and what role it plays?
The Watershed Project Database?
Yeah.
Uh, yes. So the Watershed Project Database, all of the projects in that prioritization list for each OWAP, each project is uploaded into our Watershed Project Database. That's a DEC database of potential projects. And that's sort of where this information lives. Like it's obviously it's in a report somewhere too, but it's accessible. I believe it's publicly accessible, and it's searchable by definitely by basin to look for all of the projects. And that is one requirement in moving projects along through the funding sources of DEC is that projects have a watershed ID number, which is just when the projects get uploaded, they each are assigned a specific number. So that's sort of the repository for all of the projects coming out of all of the Lake Watershed Action Plans. Does that answer your question, Dave?
Yes, thanks.
Julia Crocker, are you here?
Yeah, I just had a clarifying question on the last slide for who does this work or who performs the work. You said the projects usually are put out to bid, and I just wanted to make sure that when you said projects, you were talking about the Lake Watershed Action Plans.
I am, yeah. Like I would have been better to say assessment rather than projects, but yes. And that, definitely when it's through the DEC enhancement funding, we put it out on the, state bid registry. Other places might be a little bit different. Like an NRCD might already have a grant or a contract to perform some work, and they may or may not already have a contractor that they want to work with, or they might put it out to bid through their own process. But that's generally how it works. Yes, and I do mean assessments, not projects.
Natalie Fisher. You have to
Yes,
unmute.
yes, hi. So you had mentioned as funding sources, clean water service providers. Who are they, and how do we find which ones might apply to our lake? And then the same question for the NRCD, National Resource Conservation Districts.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in one of those or not?
So I think we're going to talk a little bit more about funding specifically later. So I don't want to get too into the weeds. Is that right? Like, are we going to talk about all this stuff later today?
Yes, I think there are speakers who will talk about funding from others' perspectives. Yes.
Okay, I can answer kind of generally. So the clean water service providers exist in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins. They are somewhat aligned with the tactical basins, and kind of in my presentation, there was a link on that page, how locations are determined, that goes to a website that will show you where clean water service providers are working region by region. So you can determine where you are lines up with one of those. And then the NRCDs align a little bit more closely with counties, though not always. And I think that Sarah just put something in the chat that might be a link to figuring out where they're, oh no, yep, link to conservation districts. So yeah, you can find your conservation district online. There's a conservation district for every place in the state. So those are statewide entities.
Okay, and they are separate from regional planning commissions?
Yes.
Okay.
Natalie, you'd actually be with me in the Ottaquechee Natural Resources Conservation District.
Okay, good
So-
to know.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any more questions right now in the chat.
Jack has his hand up. Go ahead, Jack.
Thanks, Allison. You sure covered a lot of material,
Thank you.
important material. They're not making any more lakes. So what you say is really important. A few years ago, the DEC, in prioritizing its funding, indicated that it would be prioritizing to some of the higher quality lakes. And I just wondered if you could speak to that. I wonder if lakes that are being considered for A1 and other things that are high quality, would they have points taken against them in terms of applying for water quality grants? Because they were, my understanding that these areas would be would have available funding and those sorts of things. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more towards that. And also, in writing these, maybe you covered this and I missed it, but can your DEC committee be consulted for advice? Who does the writing? Is it the Lake Association itself, or do some of their partners, such as the in our area, the Conservation District Administrator has been a tremendous help. Can you just say some general things about that? High quality lakes and then writing and prioritization.
Sure. So I will say some of the OAPs that DEC has done or is currently doing are on some of those high quality lakes. The ones that come to mind are like Lake Willoughby or the Seymour and Echo Lakes. Those are oligotrophic lakes with high, with pretty good water quality, but they do have increasing phosphorus trends, which is sort of alarming because they are sort of these clean oligotrophic lakes that are suddenly having these inputs of phosphorus from somewhere. And so I think that in some ways, I wouldn't say that we prioritize high quality A1 waters or potential A1 waters, just because, doing an LWAP on a lake that has really good water quality and not a lot of issues would be difficult because, as I said, the assessment is really to look for problem areas. But really pristine lakes that suddenly have increases in phosphorus are concerning to us. And so those lakes are prioritized, even though they might not have as high of phosphorus levels as other lakes in the state. That's through the DEC funding. I think if there are lakes out there who have pretty good or really good water quality and wanted to apply for funding through like a QUISP or the Lake Champlain Basin program, they might get a different answer, based on the requirements of those funding sources. But it's just an LWAP is not really a good tool for preservation or conservation. And I know I've heard people talk about that before, and just in the experience that we've had over the last 6 years, what we're really looking at is restoration. And so if a lake doesn't have a lot of restoration needs, an LWAP wouldn't be an appropriate tool. And the second question was, who's writing the Lake Watershed Action Plans? So generally speaking, it is the environmental contractor or an NRCD, whoever's kind of gotten the grant to perform the work is often the one writing the report and writing the plan in conjunction with the Lake Association. And then, yes, like I can be consulted for technical advice. I often read drafts, stuff like that. So it is whoever is getting the grant to do the work is usually the entity that writes the report. Any other questions?
Are there any other questions for Allison? Lisa, is anything else in the chat?
Nothing else, no.
Nothing else? Okay,
Right on time.
that was great. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you,
Dave?
everybody.
All right, so our next speaker, let me first say that, Allison had many links in her presentation, and these presentations should be available on the FlugLab website within a few days. So if you want to use these links, look for it under the events tab on the FlugLab website. All right, our next speaker is Evan Fitzgerald. Evan is the lead consultant for Fitzgerald Environmental Associates, principal hydrologist there. And he's going to talk about the technical process involved in Watershed Action Plan.
All right. Thank you, Dave. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Let me get this presentation going here. And actually, I'm going to be tag teaming with my colleague, Frank Piasecki, who's on the call. So I'll just introduce us real quick, and Frank can introduce himself as well. So Evan Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald Environmental, we're a small team up here in Colchester, Vermont. We work all over Vermont, in New York and New Hampshire as well, primarily in water resources consulting. So rivers, stormwater, lakes, and wetlands. So let me get this presentation going. Okay. And how's that? Everybody see screen share mode? Great. All right. Frank, are you on? Do you mind just introducing yourself quickly?
Hey there, everyone. I'm Frank Piasecki. I'm a watershed scientist at Fitzgerald, and I've worked on a number of the Lake Watershed action plans that we've been a part of, and I'm excited to continue working on them into the future.
Great. So I just wanted to start by giving a bit of an overview of where our team has been working. And I should say too, I thought Allison's introduction was excellent and covered the overview of all, everything LWAP. We're going to dive in a little more deeply into the actual methodology that we follow and others follow in doing this work, how we do the field work, how we prioritize projects, and then also how we take those projects that have those concept designs or 30% designs, and how we work with the partners to move those along to construction, which is a whole nother phase of work that we're involved in as well. So before Frank gets into the kind of nitty gritty of the field work, et cetera, I just wanted to point out this map, show you where we've been working, where we've completed 4 LWAPs to date. We started, Allison mentioned a few of these. We started in Lake Eden, Lake Elmore, we worked on Lake Dunmore, and we just finished up with Keeler Bay. And we're currently working on a few others, Woodford Lake, Halls Lake, and Fairfield Pond. I thought it might be interesting for folks to understand sort of the evolution of the Lake Watershed Action Plan, how that became named. And because there was a group of us working on this, ourselves, DEC, and the conservation districts about 8 years ago, doing what we called at the time stormwater master plans for lakes. This was before we coined the term, Lake Watershed Action Plan. And so I'll point to Lake Bombazine and Lake St. Catherine, these ones here in the western part of the state. We started out working on those, trying to apply something we were very familiar with as a group, which is stormwater master planning, which is a very similar playbook. That's where you go into a town, look in the urban and suburban areas for stormwater issues, prioritize a list with very similar prioritization criteria as the LWAP, and then move into concept designs. But what we were finding was that rubric, for a stormwater master plan didn't fit very well around these more rural lakes. It fit reasonably well with Bombazine and Lake St. Catherine because there is a little bit higher intensity of development around those lakes. We were working on those with Hillary Solomon, Pulteney Meadowy Conservation District. But we were finding ourselves asking, well, what about the streams and what about the shoreline, and how does this all fit together relatively in terms of the loading in the watershed? So I just wanted to provide that context. When we got to Eden and worked on the Lake Eden LWAP, it became clear that we really needed to have this broader perspective. So that's what Frank's going to talk about now.
Hi there, everyone. So the first step we take when we start these projects is to kind of get the lay of the land and gather all the information we can that can help direct us towards problem areas and the things that, lake associations and residents are worried about around these lakes and in these watersheds. So like a stormwater master plan, we start by just gathering all of the data that we can find that's pertinent to the area, and often these watersheds straddle different towns. So it's a bit of a data gathering exercise where we take town plans, regional plans, basin plans, lake scorecards, basically any information we can get that will lead us towards what people are concerned about and what problems that these watersheds are facing. Part of that is also gathering mapping data that exists for the whole state and kind of bringing that into the watershed that we're focusing on. So I've got a few of the maps we made for the Fairfield Pond Lake Watershed Action Plan here, where we looked at where there were impervious surfaces or agricultural land within that shoreland area, in that 250-foot buffer from the shore of the pond. And then we also looked at the land use that exists within the entire watershed up in the top right, just to get a sense of, what are we dealing with here for the streams? Do they run through developed areas or agriculture or forest? And what can that tell us ahead of time about maybe prioritizing certain streams for assessments into the future? And then the bottom right is another map of this with wetlands in the watershed and the town roads that are hydrologically connected, color-coded by whether they meet MRGP standards, which is basically a set of standards that helps us see whether those roads need work for erosion problems or otherwise. So the other key piece of starting these up is meeting with the different stakeholders who know the lay of the land a lot better than we do as we're coming into this. So lake associations are super valuable in the get-go because you guys know where the problems are and what you've seen happening over the past 10, 20 years in a lake, and what has changed. So talking to lake associations, DEC, town officials, conservation districts, anyone who's familiar with the lake, and getting a sense of where problems are and where we should be focusing our efforts ahead of starting up. So once we've determined problem areas that we want to focus on for this work, we will mobilize for field assessments of those 3 different sectors that Allison mentioned. So we will kind of split those up. Oftentimes we'll look at different pieces of it all in one field day, but we do shoreland assessments both from the water, often doing a boat tour around the shoreline, trying to locate any spots where the shoreline is affected and could have a project done to restore it. We do stream assessments that follow the Stream Geomorphic Assessment Phase 2 Light protocol, which is a protocol developed by DEC for assessing streams to help kind of characterize geomorphic issues with them and where projects could happen to fix them. And then we also do roadway and land use assessments. So that middle picture there is a picture of, a farm road, so not a town road, but you can see that in the rainstorm that cornfield and the road is directing a lot of dirty stormwater down, and that top picture is actually where that stormwater is entering the lake. So especially rainy days can be very fruitful for finding spots where a water quality project would have a good impact because you can see what the water is doing. So in this field work, we are identifying areas that could have projects done with this form that I've got screenshotted there. So we will drop a point on a map with all of these characteristics filled out when we find these locations for projects, and that will help us populate that prioritization matrix that Allison was talking about, and we'll attach photos as well. So here I've got another screenshot of a prioritization matrix that we worked on. Again, just a few of the columns of it because these tables are very large. A lot goes into this scoring. But this will be, many rows of different projects that we've identified for a Lake Watershed Action Plan, with each one being a project on a road or on a shoreline or on a stream, characterized by, the amount of impervious acreage that's being treated by this project, or the amount of erosion that could be stabilized. And all of that goes into figuring out a water quality benefit, and we make cost estimates as well that can go into a project efficiency of dollars per pound of phosphorus. And on the left there, I've got a problem area summary, which is kind of, a selection of the projects we identify will get brought to this level of detail where we'll put together one of these that has a little more information than the table, but is not quite to the level of a conceptual or 30% design. And these can be really valuable looking forward, so that, once maybe the conceptual designs that got developed have been built, these could be next steps for a watershed. And finally, for me, I've got here some graphs that we put together for Lake Dunmore and Fern Lake, which these two were done within the same Lake Watershed Action Plan. They're right next to each other in the same watershed. And these numbers are based on all of the projects that we identified in the field for each of these watersheds, and kind of characterize where we're seeing nutrient loading coming from, and take away the forest land that's kind of not anthropogenic, not from what people are doing in the watershed. And this breakdown can really help prioritize projects in different areas, because a lot of these watersheds are very forested, and you can't, get rid of phosphorus in the forest, but you can look at, shoreland areas where we have a lot of development and see that in Lake Dunmore, that's a big source of nutrient loading, and prioritize doing work in that location because you can get a lot of bang for your buck for projects in the shoreland.
Great. And I'll just, I'm going to pick it up from here and talk about some concepts of designs, but nice job, Frank. And just to follow up on something Frank said, it's not that we can't address things that are happening in the forest sector. I guess in these rural watersheds, forest lands make up the lion's share of the drainage, and it would be impractical, I think, is the way to think about it. In a lot of cases, it'd be impractical for lake associations and partners and consultants and those of us trying to mitigate water quality problems to go hunting all over that huge area of forest land, a lot of times of which is privately owned. So these pie charts are intended to show where can we, focus our efforts, and what do we think are the relative anthropogenic loads from these different sectors. Okay. Now I'm going to talk for a couple minutes. I think I have about 5 minutes now about the conceptual designs. So Allison spoke about these. She mentioned that a conceptual design is a 30% design. It's not quite ready to be implemented. The way you could think about a concept design is in my view, is a proof of concept. So we want to take this list of projects that we have. We've prioritized them. Now we get a short list of sites that we want to move forward with concept designs. Now we need to go make sure a few things. We need to make sure, like Allison said, the landowner's on board. So we got to go have discussions with the landowners, often with the lake associations or folks who are their neighbors. So we got to make sure they're on board with a potential project. Then we need to collect a little bit of information. Sometimes that could be topographic survey or simple measurements, of the project area. For example, here, this is a project on Lake Dunmore on the east shore, where a stream comes down under Lake Dunmore Road. It's got some erosion features as it approaches the lake. You can kind of see from these photographs, it's got some unstable banks and unstable bed. And this concept design illustrates some improvements with vegetation and also some interventions in the channel itself with stone and, trying to mitigate this erosion that's gotten out of control. So a concept design in this case is moving this idea of from a project that was identified relatively quickly in the field to a proof of concept, and how much phosphorus reduction do we think will occur with the project, and what is our ballpark cost of implementation, including design and gathering permits and all that kind of thing. So a couple examples that we've helped partners bring from this concept, actually from LWAP all the way through to implementation. I wanted to show you just share our experience with that. So this one is the, again, in Lake Dunmore. This is the Magoon access point. It's on the west shore. It's a Vermont Fish and Wildlife public access. And it's one of these sites where, you've got a sloping access and parking area, a gravel area that drains directly into the lake. So this concept, it's got a lot of nice color on it, illustrates what we were looking at in the field. These purple lines show the different drainage boundaries. The blue lines and arrows show the way the way stormwater is flowing. And we had identified 2 areas of green space where small sedimentation basins could be implemented. And it might be small text for some of you to see, but down the lower left-hand corner, some numbers here where we quantified how much volume would we expect each of these to have. And that's sort of a surrogate for how much phosphorus would we expect these basins to mitigate or attenuate on an annual basis. So this was actually picked to move forward to final design. And I just wanted to show you, in this case, where we're working in a pretty tight space, there's a lot of infrastructure, property boundaries are very close to the edge of the work area. You really need construction drawings to move a project like this forward. And in fact, being on state land and working with the state as a partner is another reason why you need this level of detail. So these are just examples of the construction drawings that we developed, and then some photographs of this getting implemented, which was about a year ago. It was last spring in 2023. And then just quickly, another example that was implemented, Allison touched on this, and I don't want to delve too much into this one. I think Peter's going to talk about it as well. This is the town recreation area up in Eden. It's really a gem of a park. It's town owned. It's a beach. There's some cabins and recreation area. But as Allison said, there's runoff coming from the parking lot. Again, this is just to show you, here's the concept design. Here's the final design, or one sheet of the final design. So again, we had to go from that proof of concept to how are we actually going to dig this out? How are we going to connect, the stormwater that collects in this basin into a pipe, and at what elevation does that pipe need to be at to get from the outlet of the basin over to this other area with these other 2 culverts, daylight. So a bit more work is needed to define the actual, construction specifications, and that's what this drawing did. And here's a photograph. I agree. This is one of my favorite projects, like Allison said. This one's performing really well. It's, the Northwoods Stewardship Center was involved in the plantings, and we've stopped by here a couple of times. It's really performing great. And I think that's all we had here. Exit. Stop sharing. I can answer any questions, or
Jody White has a question. Jody, are you here?
Yeah, how much did those two projects cost? And then for like that sort of thing, is there a percentage of the like let's say there's 100% runoff the way it is there a percentage that captures
Mhm.
for like those two? Just sort of for examples and thinking about other boat ramps and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, good question. So, uh, dredge my memory a bit here. Maybe Dave Johnson can help me remember the costs. I think to move so there were two pieces of the cost for implementation for that. The one on Lake Dunmore, the Magoon access, there was the design and permitting, although I don't think any state permits were needed, but some permit coordination was needed. And then there was, of course, hiring a contractor. So I think our fee for design permitting was somewhere around $6,000 or $7,000, somewhere in that ballpark. Might have been a little bit more with construction oversight that we provided. And then the construction, if I remember right, was around $25,000. Does that sound right, Dave?
Yeah, those are close, I think, Evan.
Okay. And on that one in particular, I guess to generally answer your question, Jody, about the basis for design, generally, part of it is like what will fit in that space, right? And that kind of defines how much treatment can happen at any given site. On those, I think our target was trying to treat the 1-inch rainstorm, the 1-inch 1-day rainstorm. That's considered the water quality storm. It's a good target for these sort of repeat storms that we're seeing probably more frequently these days. And it's those level of storms that are carrying the most over time, carrying the most pollutants into the lake when you sort of add those up cumulatively, as compared to like one big flood. That's why we target the 1-inch rainstorm. And on the Magoon side, I think we didn't have quite the space to be able to treat, quote unquote, treat 100% of that 1-inch rainstorm. Whereas I think over on the Eden recreation area, I think we were able to treat close to 100% of that 1-inch rainstorm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh.
Jack has his hand up.
Yeah, Evan, thanks very much. I think those slides really helped us understand. The question I have is, after you finish the project and you have those beautiful pictures, you have these nice gardens. One of the things that happens in Vermont and elsewhere is little trees grow up in those areas. And so, there's the maintenance. You're talking about doing the project, but the maintenance of these and maintaining this, is also an issue. So do you provide guidance, or does someone provide guidance, and how does that get done down the road? Because little trees become big trees, and that can be good or bad for what you're doing.
Great question. Yeah, we often, stop at the end of construction and celebrate, and don't always remember that, maintaining these best management practices is really the only way to ensure that they're going to perform as designed. In the case of Dunmore, we did, in fact, the funding dictated that we come up with an operation and maintenance plan. It's really quite simple. It's just like defining how frequently the basins should be checked over, defining when sediment removal in the basin might be needed based on sort of the accumulation depth, and then defined a maintenance frequency for mowing and vegetation. And I don't know if Dave, you want to chime in. You guys are the champion of that, given you got the grant.
Well, we negotiated an operation and maintenance plan with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we agreed that the association would take on replanting if necessary, and it is necessary actually. So we'll be doing some replanting this spring. And Fish and Wildlife would take care of, I think, cleaning out the trench drain and that kind of thing.
Any other questions?
Nothing
Anything-
else in the chat.
Any other comments? Dave, do you have any comments about what's happened at Dunmore, how that's working out?
Well, I have a whole talk on that later.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, you're coming up later. All right. We'll take a break then. We've built in a 10-minute break at this point, so why don't we do that and reconvene at about what time is it now? About 10:21 we will reconvene. So thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue now with our next speaker. Dave, do you want to introduce our next speaker? Dave, we can't hear you. Can't hear you still, Dave. Why don't I go ahead and welcome Lauren Jennis, who's our next speaker. Lauren, are you here? There you
Yes,
are.
I'm here. Thank you. I'm
Thank you.
just figuring out how to share my screen.
You should be able to.
Can everyone see that, my screen?
Yes.
Oops. Now I have to find more. Oh, okay. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Lauren Jeunesse Neen, and I've worked as an environmental analyst at the Lake Champlain Basin Program for the past 5 years. The Lake Champlain Basin Program, we're a congressionally designated initiative that was formed back in the 1990s to bring together Vermont, New York, and Quebec for the management of Lake Champlain. And we receive primarily funding from the Environmental Protection Agency, which we give out in grants and local research, education opportunities, and also planning and implementation work. And that is where lake and watershed action plans fall into our work. So we're guided by a management plan for Lake Champlain called Opportunities for Action. This plan is updated every 5 years, and the last plan we did was in 2022. And our plan has 4 main goals of clean water, healthy ecosystems, thriving communities, and an informed and involved public. And under those 4 main goals, we have a series of objectives. And so lake and watershed action plans do fall under objectives under all 4 goals of our management plan. So they're a great way to be funded, though you do have to be within the Lake Champlain boundary to apply for our funding. So far, we have funded 5 lake and watershed action plans. This first wave was through what used to be our technical grants budget. And that now, because we've grown, has changed into just a research grant category. So in the next slide, I'll say which grant category is the most applicable to lake and watershed action plans. But we've funded the Fairfield Pond, Lake Iroquois, Caspian Lake, Lake St. Catherine, and Keeler Bay lake and watershed action plans. And you can see on the screen which organizations applied to and received that funding. 3 of these groups use Fitzgerald Environmental as their consultant group. And then Lake Iroquois is working with SLR Consulting, and the Caspian Lake group is working with Fluid State Consulting. So those are the 3 consulting firms that each of these groups have put out to a competitive bid as part of their grant with the Lake Champlain Basin Program. So right now, the most applicable grant category for lake and watershed action plans is our clean water planning grant category. This is an opportunity that's put out every fall, along with 7 other grant categories that people can apply to. And the grant category maximum limit is up to $75,000. That was last year's number. This upcoming year's RFP might change. But the goal of the grant category is to support projects that will provide planning, design, or prioritization of future water quality improvement projects. So that is a very clearly aligned with lake and watershed action plans. So this is a live link that you can get right to our website, which lists all of our grant opportunities. And I'll share this. We'll share this after this day of presentations. So there are a few different grant requirements that are specific to the Lake Champlain Basin Program compared to state and clean water service provider funding. We have NEWIPIC, the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, as our fiscal agent. They're based out of Lowell, Massachusetts. So all of our official grant contracts are held by NEWIPIC. And so in order to do this work, if awarded funding, you'll execute a formal grant contract with NEWIPIC, and it's probably going to be U.S. Environmental Protection Agency funding. So we require of all of these grants that you utilize the LWAP guidance provided by DEC Lakes and Ponds program. We require that you do work with Allison as a project advisor throughout the course of your project. And then a quality assurance project plan, the development of that is something very specific to EPA funding. Any project that has the collection or analysis of environmental data to make environmental decisions requires a QAP. And so before you form the data library or before you start to do field work, you have to go through this quality assurance project plan process that your project Lake Champlain Basin Program project officer would lead you through. And that's a formal agreement between the Basin Program, NEWIPIC, and then the US EPA about how you're going to go about the collection and analysis of your data. QAPs are kind of like recipe books that you could hand off to another group and they could do the exact same process and get the same results. And then also a part of our just general grant requirements, throughout the contract period, we require quarterly reporting. And then at the end of your project, you submit a formal final report to close out the project along with any of the project deliverables. And those deliverables are described in the DEC guidance. So again, this is a summary slide. I'm happy to answer any questions, but please go on to our website to see the most up-to-date grant opportunities. The clean water grants and also healthy ecosystem grants can also be used if you have a project identified through a lake and watershed action plan, like a green stormwater infrastructure project or a boat ramp improvement. Those can also be funded through our grant opportunities. But again, this next round of opportunities will be released late summer this year. And for lake and watershed action plan work, I would assume that if you apply in like August 2024, we'll go through the grant contracting process winter 2024. And so you can ideally start field work in 2025, though it might be delayed a little bit because of the quality assurance project plan development, which is just another timeline step in the process. So yeah, I kept it brief, but I'm happy to answer any questions about the presentation or the Lake Champlain Basin Program in general.
Angela Anderson Adams. As a request.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to see the first slide again, if I could, that shows the Lake Champlain Basin, Watershed Basin. I'm new to the area, so I'm always looking at maps. Thank you.
Yep. And once I stop sharing my screen, I can get you a link to our atlas, which is an online map layer, and you can toggle on towns and counties, so you can zoom into exactly where you are. But yeah, we really value all of the work that's done, especially in the upper reaches of our watershed. Lake Champlain has a really large land to lake ratio. It's about 18-1. It's one of the largest in the country, compared to the Great Lakes, which is only 3-4. So that's why we focus so much of our funding on the restoration of other lakes and ponds and river systems, because that all eventually feeds into Lake Champlain.
Thank you so much.
Dave?
Dave has his hand up.
Does New York have a similar program for lakes in New York?
It's a separate program. We really encourage and require folks in Vermont to follow Vermont DEC guidelines. New York DEC does not have a similar lake and watershed action plan process or timeline, but we have funded, I forget exactly what lake, but they were in the Adirondacks. So it's a similar process, and we make sure that they follow any New York DEC guidelines. But lake and watershed action plans are a great model, and New York is interested in eventually adopting a similar process. So you're leading the charge, Vermont.
Martha Winston has a question.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
We are up at the upper reaches of the Lake Champlain watershed. We're at Peachum Pond. And I'm wondering, the whole funding thing is something I haven't investigated yet. Would you recommend starting with the Lake Champlain funds or programs first, applying to those, or applying to those plus applying to DEC at the same time if we're interested in starting an watershed action plan? Who would you go to first?
You can definitely talk with me about a grant application to the Lake Champlain Basin Program. I'm not sure of the process of also applying to the state of Vermont at the same time. That might get a little bit confusing, but yeah, you're welcome to learn more and look at the grant opportunities that we have, and staff are always available to answer questions. We can't actually help write the application, but we can give general advice that we would give to any applicant. So if you're in the watershed, I think we are a good funding source. We have a lot of federal funds right now, though it is a competitive application process. So you would submit an application to one grant category, and you'd be ranked with all of the other applications that come into that same grant category. And then a funding recommendation is given, and our Lake Champlain Steering Committee ultimately decides which projects are awarded for funding.
Okay, thank you. I will get in touch. Thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah. My email address in the presentation is a hyperlink too, to make it very easy.
Jack, you have your hand up. Oh, you're on mute, Jack.
Thank you, Lauren. I have a similar question to Martha's. And that is, you said it was competitive. What is the percentage of funding that the Lake Champlain Basin program has relative to the other programs? Presumably it's not 100%. And then also, do you make available to those who are preparing applications successful applications that have been in the past so that people can see, what's been successful and perhaps what's not been successful?
We don't share other groups' application materials, but we can informally share work plans, and I have shared the quality assurance project plans, so you can build off of the previous work that was done. And then like informally through conversations, the staff would help you get the best output for how to shape the application to make, the work plan to make all requirements, but the applications themselves are confidential. And then to get to your first question about, are you asking about the Lake Champlain Basin program funding compared to state funding, or like within Lake Champlain Basin program grant categories?
Well, specifically the category for watershed action plans for your organization, the Lake Champlain Basin, and comparing that with other sources that would be available to the audience here today, the DEC. What's the percentage of successful grants in the various programs that you're talking about today?
It's hard to give an exact answer for success rate. As our funding has increased over time, we try to build the grant categories so we can fund as many projects as we can. But sometimes we're not. Sometimes it's only half of the grants can get funded. Sometimes everyone can get funded. So I'd say about 50% to 100% of grants in any given year in any given grant category are awarded funding, but it's really based on how much funding we have available. You can see on my screen what I'm doing, but I'm gonna stop sharing and find how much money total we had available in the clean water planning grant category last year.
And while you're doing that, Allison had a comment about question here.
Yeah, I was just saying that LCBP, I believe, Lauren, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's just one funding round per year for these kinds of plans, whereas if you apply to a clean water service provider, they usually have multiple rounds per year. So you could apply to LCBP and then have a chance to apply to a QUISP later if you don't get a grant, or vice versa. But just, I thought I'd mention that the funding cycles.
And what percent do you fund, Allison?
I don't fund anything. You'd have to talk to the clean water service providers. And I think I don't know if we're talking about that later, but for assessments, only one has been funded in the state through a QUISP, but I believe it's the only one that has actually been applied for also. So 100% maybe right now. Because it's new, that the clean water service provider funding sources.
So are you saying that if you're not in the Lake Champlain Basin, you can't apply for a watershed grant, other than to do what you had suggested with that one other option?
So clean water service providers are throughout the Lake Champlain Basin and the Lake Memphremagog Basin, which covers a good portion of the state. So you can apply to them if you are in those basins. Outside of those basins, it's a little bit more difficult. That's why DEC Lakes and Ponds, which is separate from the QUISP funding, prioritizes outside of the Champlain and Memphremagog basins. But those are not grants that you can apply to. Those are contracts coming from the state for specific lakes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I get it.
And I found our RFP from last year, and because it's no longer linked on our website, but we had $4 million total to give out to all of the grant categories, 7 grant categories within this clean water and healthy ecosystems grant category. And so this opportunity is the first one on our annual cycle that comes out. And then it's our research grants that's run through our technical advisory committee. And then education and outreach and organizational support grants come next. So if you are a group in the Lake Champlain watershed and aren't familiar with all of our grant opportunities, I really recommend you take a look at this RFPs page, and then feel free to reach out to me, or if you know another one of our staff, we can answer any questions that you have about that. We fund aquatic invasive species grants, we fund habitat improvement grants, we fund working in local schools, we fund larger education and outreach projects. The organizational support grant category helps get computers and organizational capacity stuff funded. So we do have a lot of opportunities that we offer every year.
I don't have any more questions in the chat.
Any other comments from anyone? Any other questions? Maybe one last thing, Lauren, could you maybe just very briefly describe the QApp, what that really is, if for people who maybe haven't had to work with that before?
Sure, and after I'm done, I'll put a link into the chat to our quality assurance project page. But basically, it's the simplest terms, it's a recipe book that you're gonna follow to do the data library and the field data. And it ensures that just the quality assurance of the data collected. It's a requirement of the EPA. We could give you previous examples of CLAPs that were approved for the other lake and watershed action plans that we funded, but the EPA also gives you a template to start with. You write an overview of the project, what tasks you're going to plan to undertake, and then there's sections of the QAP that say exactly what protocols you're going to follow. Like Evan referenced earlier, the SGA Light phase 2 or something assessment. So you would say that in the QAP, like that's how we're going to do this, or you would say exactly how you're going to boat around the shore to look for signs of erosion, or you'd say we're going to follow the lake-wise assessment protocol to work with landowners. And then the next part of the QAP is saying how you are going to ensure that you're going to meet those data requirements, like what type of equipment would you use in the field? How is that equipment calibrated? What are you going to do if a piece of equipment breaks? And then there's sections about how you're going to keep the data stored for a number of years in case there's questions, stuff like that. So it is a really technical document, but your chosen environmental consultant team would have a lot of experience writing QAPs, and whoever is the Lake Champlain Basin Program Project Officer. Also, we give out many grants, so we have many data quality QAPs, so we can help you speed things up and format it correctly so we know how to get it through the new EPIC and EPA approvals.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Any other questions, comments? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should move on to the next speaker to be able to stay on time.
Okay, so we've heard about funding. If a lake association is considering a watershed action plan for their lake, they also have to decide who to work with to apply to get funding and to actually execute the plan. And so our next talk is about a conservation district approach to having that work done, as opposed to having it done by the Lake Association itself. And our speaker is Peter Danforth, who's the director of the Lamoille County Conservation District. Peter?
Thanks a lot, Dave. Yes, I'm Peter Danforth, Lamoille County Conservation District. Since the previous presenters have kind of gone over the details of how Lake Watershed Action Plan is done and the details and designs and so forth, I'm going to concentrate on the overview of the partnerships required to make this work and the complexity of the partnerships, as well as an update of what we've done at Eden and Elmore. And then in the end, a recognition of what the Vermont Natural Resource Conservation districts do as administrative and coordination work. So to start right off, we were one of the lucky districts to be the first 2 Lake Watershed Action Plans done for Lake Eden and Lake Elmore. And so this is back 2017, 2018, respectively, with Eden and Elmore. And so we began by meeting with the state, the DC, town, the lake associations, both towns, to first it was ID'd through the lake scorecard as well as the tactical basin process. And we just gathered our partners together. And then we contracted Fitzgerald Environmental Associates to do the bulk of the scientific work. And then when those groups were together, we discussed and refined the scope of work. We looked for things that are already existing that the town was aware of for stormwater and flood hazards as well. And then I don't know if this is done anymore, but during the process of the assessments, we also had funding in those grants to provided for VYCC to come and do a work for a week or 2 on private lands to sort of showcase best management the best management projects, so that they were visible to some at least while the assessment was happening. So if that isn't happening now, I wish it would, because it was really critical to showcasing what we were doing. So
Can you just say, Peter, what VYCC is?
I'm sorry, Vermont Youth Conservation Corps. And I will get into that in more specifics as we go forward here. So this is sort of an overview logic model of the partners that we coordinated with for Eden and Elmore specifically. This may change depending on districts throughout the state. But as you see, if we have Lamoille County Conservation District, we administered the grant via DEC, Vermont Ecosystem Restoration Grant. At the time it was called. And we worked with the Lamoille County Planning Commission. We worked with various agencies throughout the next 5 years. As you can see there, NRCC block grants, Lake Champlain Basin Program, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. We worked with the towns of Eden and Elmore, the Boy Scouts of America and Eden specifically, and Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. I already mentioned that. And Lake Eden and Elmore associations and lakeshore owners, the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, the Northwest Stewardship Center, and other general contractors. And of course, Fitzgerald Environmental did the Lake Watershed Action Plan, the bulk of the work for the scientific analysis. So that just gives you an overview. And so now I'll go over what each of these partners did specifically. So when we worked with the Lamoille County Planning Commission, both lakes, they provided a lot of work in regards to private road or road erosion inventories. So the Planning Commission was in our sector of the state was responsible for those, which were vital to understand the aspect of runoff from roads affecting the lakes. And so the Planning Commission, however, cannot do road erosion inventories for private roads. So they trained the districts as well as private road owners to do their own road erosion inventories based upon the state's requirements. So that was really helpful, and we were able to do numerous private roads in that manner, specifically when it came to culverts that were undersized or just crowning of roads and needed stormwater projects that could be placed along the side of those roads. And they also helped a lot with coordinating town meetings for us. As far as the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, I mean, there's endless amount of work there. So they provide lake-wise trainings, current data and lake conditions, provide information on stream and crossings and culverts, partnered with the Lake Association on Greeter program and Vermont Aquatic Nuisance Prevention Program. and some of the districts as well. I think one of them at least does a greeter program with some of the lakes as well. And they awarded the initial grant through the ecosystem restoration program for this lake-wise assessment. I mean, not Lake Watershed Action Plan. The Fish and Wildlife Department also was active, helping us, do some lakeshore assessment, as well as providing information on stream crossings and potential spots for brook trout passage, if there was such a thing in the watershed. And then, of course, both Elmore and Eden boat access areas owned by Fish and Wildlife have done work based on the action plans or are about to do work. So that picture on the left is some work that was done at Eden at the next to the greeter program. And specific to Lake Eden, the Boy Scouts participated quite a bit with us. They provided workshop space so we could present shoreline best management practices a few times. That was a couple different workshops over the last 5 years. And then eventually they participated in a very large stormwater practice on their land as well, as they were cited in the assessment as an important place to do stormwater work. And so they were very good partners with us. And then, of course, the towns of Eden and Elmore provided a lot of assistance, offices for partner meetings, inputs on designs, coordination with landowners and lake associations, provided match on grants, typically in the form of in-kind time, resources, tools. And at one point, we even hired them to do work on the beach in Eden as well. So they were working hand in hand with us the whole way. And then, of course, the lake associations, probably most important partner, along with lakeshore owners, provided really critical input, and were very boots on the ground, aware of what was actually going on. I love this picture on the left there. That's after the 2019 Halloween storm on Backshore Drive in Eden. They provide forums for educational outreach in the annual meetings. And they partnered with Vermont Fish and Wildlife, of course, in the greeter program, and are basically future participants in Lakewise program and feedback on larger project designs. And I'm sure I'm missing some things, but they're very involved with us on every level at every point. And then, of course, I have to really give a shout out to the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, where we started working with them in 2019. To this day, we didn't do much work last year, but hopefully we're going to get funding this year to do continued work on private land. So I'm kind of running through this all because I know I only got 15 minutes, and I know there's some questions, I'm sure. So I'm going to get down to the bulk of it here. So this big page here, the Natural Resource Conservation Districts of Vermont. The word I like to use for the districts is that we're kind of like the scaffolding, not just for Lake Watershed action plans, but also for anything that has to do with conservation in Vermont. So for the most part, so I know some of the Lake Watershed action plans were not granted directly to the conservation districts, but the bulk of them were. And so, the work that the conservation did were pretty all comprehensive. So aside from administering them, we were kind of the central coordinators for creating the partnerships to complete the LWAPs. Meetings galore, at least 4 through the assessments and numerous others moving into design and implementation. Working with engineers to prioritize project by determining feasibility. Holding workshops for the lake associations and public to showcase and provide information on lake shore BMPs. We helped the DEC to do lake-wise assessments. We worked with VYCC and other contractors to design and implement projects. We continue to do oversight and maintenance agreements. So, when a project is put in, there's an MOU with either the public land official or a private land person, and the districts would engage with them after these projects were completed to make sure that maintenance was being provided and provided technical assistance in that manner. And then, of course, I think at least one of the districts is involved with the greeter programs directly and in coordination with aquatic invasive species as well. And as I said, just about anything having to do with LWAPs, including the creation of media releases for completed assessments, designs, and projects. So specifically in Eden, this is what happened. So we started the process, I say, in 2017. The 2019, the action plan was completed, and then throughout the next few years, many projects were brought to full design and eventually full implementation. So last summer, we were able to complete 4 implementations in Lake Eden, including the Town Beach Rain Garden, which was mentioned before by Fitzgerald Environmental. This was funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So I'm going to clarify what Vermont asbestos settlement was in place, and some of that money went to the projects for the Lake Watershed Action Plan, and it was done through an agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the money isn't directly from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but they managed it for us to use. And that we use most of that money to complete these projects. And speaking of coordination and working with landowners, so the rain garden you see on the right, that was on the town beach, we agreed to, through the settlement, to also help pay for, or we did pay for, in fact, the boat rack that needed to be replaced in front of it. So these sorts of things are sort of tit for tat things that you do when you work with landowners, and it's important to recognize where you can do that so it makes the project more feasible. And it ended up looking really great. We did a gully erosion remediation on Griggs Road. We did stormwater improvements at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Access, and we did a very large project with a Mount Norris Boy Scout reservation to the Lake Champlain Basin program, which was recently completed as well. There's one project still in process of full design, and that's in Backshore Drive, where you saw that erosion issue, for at least 3 culvert replacements, undersized culverts, lots of water coming down that hill towards the lake, flooding people's houses, as well as bringing phosphorus and sediment into the lake. So we're really looking forward to completing that one. And then, of course, continued work with DEC to do lake-wise assessments and also best management practices on private lands. Will continue on in the future, as well as identifying other projects through the action plan. For Lake Elmore, we're about 1 year behind in that process. So at this moment, we're in the full design process. We're looking to do rain gardens and lakeshore plantings in the Elmore Town Hall. Out in the upper regions of the watershed, as Allison had mentioned before, it's not just on the lake shores, but in the upper areas. We're working on Lacasse Road to do some stormwater improvements near a tributary going to Lake, actually Elmore Pond. And then Fish and Wildlife Access again. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Access is working with us, and hopefully all these will be brought to the full design by spring so that we can implement in the summer or fall. And then, of course, we also have a full design and process, or I'm sorry, preliminary design process for West Loop Road, which is on the west side of the lake, to look for stormwater improvements there. There's a lot of situations that require it on that road. And of course, also more planned outreach with lake-wise assessments with DC, and working again to identify more projects moving forward. So in terms of what all the districts do, so I know I also went over this a little bit, but I'm kind of giving you a little bit more of a refined view of, where everyone's at. There's been 13 lake watershed action plans completed or in process via the Natural Resources Conservation District's administration or coordination within Vermont at this point in 2024. So Orleans has 3, 90% complete. I believe that's their month away for completion. And I'm sure Sarah can correct me on that one. And one that's 40% complete. Grand Isle has 100% complete. Keeler Bay. Essex has 100% complete and 2 out for bid. Pulteney Meadowy, 50% complete and 1 in beginning stages. Winooski has 1 that's just about there at 90% complete. And Lamoille, of course, we've completed 2. There is a link here that I'm not going to go to, but I'm going to share this for everyone, but it just gives you a more complex look at all the work that the natural resource conservation districts have done. I kind of list them.
Say we have a couple more minutes to get some questions before we move on to the next speaker. Okay.
Yep, I'm just about there. Just about there. And it's just this little shout out for us to, if you've worked with the district, please send a testimonial of the work you've done for us, with us, either to the VACD, which is that link there, Vermont NRCDs is that, and then or to me by email, because we'll be down in the legislature next week, in the Congress next week to promote the work we've been doing. Hold on one second. In a meeting. Okay, questions, concerns.
Bridget Butler, did you have a comment or did it get answered? Or you're muted. Or maybe not. Bridget, did you want to unmute?
Yes.
And
How about I unmute first? That would be really helpful. Peter, hi. I'm wondering if you can talk about the timeline from like getting the LWAP to project completion. Like, is there an average amount of time? I know it's different for all kinds of projects, but what does that arc of the timeline look like from LWAP to completion?
Well, for us, simply put, 5 years. So you start, you start with the assessment, that's 1 year, you finish it second year, and then you go into really kind of fine tuning what projects you can do feasibly. And that takes a year on its own, a project development.
Yeah.
Because even though you have designs, 30% designs done, you can find out sort of after the fact that, oh, wait a minute, we missed something, or this project needs a little bit more refined understanding before we can get to full design. So that takes a while. And then once, another year for full design, and then another year into implementation. So for us, it took about 5 years to get to full implementation. I think it may not take that long for everyone, specifically now that there's more funding available through either, like Champlain Basin program, as well as the QUIS model, Clean Water Service Provider model is now in place. So I think we were working with what we could at the time, and now things have become really kind of focused. And so hopefully we can take that 5 year cycle down to 4 or 3 years for that matter. But in the beginnings, it was kind of a stretch,
And then the other question I had for you is, the outreach and education piece of this seems so critical to me in terms of like gathering people in and really getting them to see the watershed and the shoreline through this lens. And it carries all the way over from, getting permission from the landowner to following up on we were talking about the maintenance piece afterwards. Do you have any, like, I see that you guys did Lakewise, you're pushing the BMPs. What are your like little nuggets, like the top tips that are like, this is what worked really well for us when it came to outreach and education?
Yeah, continuity, like making sure you remain in touch with those landowners. And even though things move slowly, you just don't forget them. You try to keep that connection, and you continue to advertise whenever possible, workshops and outreach in that manner, to keep the ball rolling. I know that after the first year with Eden, there was like a lot of changeover with the town administrators, and lakes, and also the association's presidents, and there was a year there where there was not a lot done because of that, And also, I have to say too, as conservation districts, it's really important that there is sort of not a high staff turnover in order for these things to go. Because if, for instance, I had quit halfway through in this 5 year process, it would have taken at least 6 months to get someone back on board of understanding what that was, and then you would have lost a year or more of progress just because of that. So it's really important that all these partners stay in touch despite turnover, and that can be the biggest issue there.
Thank you so much.
I think we're going to have to start to move on. Yeah, to be on time.
Dave, did you have
Yes.
something quick? And we had a lot of other questions, a lot of other
Well,
comments.
I think we should move on. So
Okay.
So our next speaker is Stu Arnold from Lake Caspian, and he's going to talk from the Lake Association perspective about the creation of a watershed action plan.
Hi, everybody. This is Stu. Let me throw up my screen here and share the screen. Start. Oh, shit. Earbuds are down to 0. Anyways. Can you see me?
Yes, we are seeing something on the screen which says screen broadcast.
Okay, let me go to my, here we go. All right.
Now we see your desktop. There we go. That looks right.
All right, let me get to the top here. All right. So you can see the welcome to Caspian Lake.
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm Stu Arnold, Caspian Lake Protection Chair. I spend a lot of time out on the boat. Occasionally I get my grandson with me. I'm also a FOVLAP rep for the lake and past FOVLAP board member. My talk today is going to be on the motivation of LWAP, and then we'll go into like first steps and how I got some buy-in by the community. Talk about the grant funding and choosing the consultant, and then the field assessments, design choice, and any questions that we came up with and lessons that you may want to know about. So basically, you know, our motivation is like your lake. Our lake is a very special place, and Caspian is a oligotrophic lake. We've talked a lot about details, but from the environment side, it's a beautiful body of water, and historically, everyone has wanted to keep it as clean as possible. There's a broad view there of the lake, picking up a little bit of the shoreline you can see, and another view of the shoreline looking back. Our lake's 109, about 800 acres, about 1.5 miles wide. It is a fishing body. It is a recreation body of water. So what it is, it's a clean lake. It's beautiful in the winter. It's calm and peaceful many times of the year. And it's well regarded in that fashion. So these are the motivating factors to maintain a clean and pristine lake. It's a home to 7 years of nesting loons, and we've been very successful with that. My photographer wanted to make sure that we wanted to show that we weren't up close. She has got quite a big lens there to capture some of these pictures. So, but it's also, our lake's a home for people. We have great boating. We have some water skiing. We have fishing, but it's a very peaceful lake with a lot of stand-up boards, canoes, kayaks, swimming. So our concerns came about in 2017. Kind of came to we always knew that we needed to protect the lake, but we were seeing some significantly increasing rise in phosphorus. Both spring and the summer was done by lay monitoring for quite a many years, and I've taken that over 5-6 years ago. Fortunately, our Seshi dish and chlorophyll readings remain fairly stable in the high oligotrophic rating. But the shoreline's, stressed. The whole watershed is considered highly disturbed because, and you can kind of see our 800-acre lake has about a 3,500-acre watershed in that picture. When I was a board member with FOVLAP, other bodies of waters came up with issues and what was going on at that time. And so you may see your lake on there and what we talked about at FOVLAP that particular time. And so we knew we had culvert problems. Here's a case where one year the culvert was looking pretty bad and the next year it fell in. The good news is this one's been fully repaired and is in really good shape now. So I think we realized I had Mark Mitchell out with Danielle Ozarski, Amy Peacock we started the idea of catching up to Seymour, and they were well ahead of us in Lakewise. So we got Lakewise going. We started doing some sampling of the lake itself and tributaries, and Mark was very instrumental in seeing what we were collecting for data there and said, we really need to get you into the trib monitoring program. And we started adding that to the list. And the phosphorus trend was picked up in a few spots during heavy rain events. So we were eligible and highly encouraged to do a Lakewise assessment. We started in 2019 with the trib monitoring. In 2020, we were underway with the Lake Watershed Action Plan. So community buy-in was easy. We pitched it a little bit with a parade. I continue to promote our lake protection with our little float and our parade. I think the biggest thing was this greater community visit, Greater Greensboro community visit that took place in fall of 2019. And zooming in on these details, whoops, sorry about that. I think I touched that picture. I might have lost it. No, okay. We were able to talk about what was happening, and then we really took some action steps. We formed a whole committee of people to make a task force at addressing water quality and lake protection. That added a lot of people to what was a very small group of people prior to that, capturing data. And that gave us the local resources to talk with Orleans County Conservation District to help sponsor us for the LWAP, to getting Danielle out as well as our Lamoille Basin planner. And so we got the ball rolling. We got the grant funded. Once we had our grant was 48,000, 52,000. I can't remember the exact number, but it was, to get things going and would include all the way to the 30% designs. So we met as a community in a small group to just determine what consultant we wanted to hire. And we used Fluid State Consulting, Dana Allen, to do the technical side. And So I'm going to jump to his screen here. So does everybody see our Caspian Lake Watershed Action Plan on the screen?
Yes.
Great. So with this, we were able to get rolling. So it was about 2021 when we had our first desktop assessments. COVID was going on 2020, 2021, and slowed things down just a bit. But they were able to do a lot of data library action. So I'm just going to show you the sponsors here. We had the Lake Champlain Basin, the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control, Orleans County District were our key sort of governmental, Fluid State Consulting, and then with Fluid State, Just Water, MSK Engineers, and Watersheds to Wildlife were groups that actually did put their feet on the ground and helped us gather the data. So basically, we produced the plan. There's a little introduction here on who we are. Again, 800-acre lake in our town, and we concentrated on our main tributaries going into the lake. And then we look at the roads. So you saw the culvert that was up on the north end of the lake, just 100 yards from the lake. But within the watershed, they looked at all the different roads that might impact the little driveways that come into the lake for the property owners. You know, they were able to do analysis on the watershed itself. We ended up working with the town. The town's highly involved in the effectivity of making some improvements. Certain places were noted specifically as places that needed a great deal of attention. And then the data also picked up, you know, very great information about our land use, forestry cover, agricultural cover. So we found that the benefit of understanding what's in our watershed greatly enhances the community's view. And this tool that I'm looking at right now with you is available to everybody in the community to look at and ask questions. Wetlands were highlighted. Our tributaries, as we mentioned, were looked at. Most of the actual tributaries are on the north end of the lake. The south end of the lake, the watershed pinches right around the lake. So I just want to say to people that are thinking about doing a watershed action plan, it's provided our community with so much data that it's and as we get down through here, lake-wise assessments throughout the whole state has been successful. And likewise here, we've done over 45, about 15 a year the last 3 years. And they provided a lot of shoreline, lake-wise, has provided that shoreline data for field assessment. Anything else? Is there a question?
I think we can move on to questions. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anyone have their hand up? See?
I don't see any hands up yet. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead if you have your hand up. Go ahead. unmute yourself.
There we go. I have to unmute myself in two different spots. I see that this is this tool that you're showing all the different layers on. That's something that you need to have permission to log into, right? Or is there is that something that's accessible by people to just check out and see what you were able to do?
I think it's publicly available to our community, so I would say it's publicly available to everyone. I can put that in a place where it can be gathered.
Okay, you might just need an ArcGIS login, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat.
Okay, then. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just last, I mean, the thing that's we're going to use this now that our plan is in final report, but now we're in the execution and implementation on the 30% designs. We've picked 5 that we're moving forward with. As Peter talked about, we'll get that work done and extra funding we need, and we'll be proceeding along. But we actually have 85 projects with design with phosphorus success. If sort of each one has a metric for the phosphorus loading that project could produce a decrease in. And so this plan will last us for years and years to tackle those 5, 10, 15 at a time. So it's been very beneficial. Thank you.
You mentioned that the Lake Association was critical in sort of getting the ball rolling and working with your conservation district. Since you got them involved, what has the Lake Association role been?
I have the stewards committee that so we have a Streamwise group going on right now. They have their own grant. They've sought after some grant work for streams. The Lakewise we're still in the implementation with those 5 projects, and we'll bring them to 100% this year. So it's a team of people. It's an active community, and the other thing is, I think that we had nearly 100% buy-in from every property owner around the lake upstream to walk their properties, to join in how they can. And many, like in the Lakewise situation, are do-it-yourselfers on their best management practices. So we've been successful that way. You still get a few people, that's great, and moving on. But it's generally, as I said, nearly everyone has taken an effort to make things better.
We do have a question from Angela Anderson Adams, if we have time.
Yes, I think we do.
Hi, I just had a question about the trophic level of lakes and how one determines that, and where can one research that for one's lake?
If you Google Vermont Lake Scorecard, I think you'll be able to find, and you enter the name of the lake. I think you'll be able to determine it.
Yeah, here's our scorecard that's up to date right now. So you can see that the light blue line in the light blue background in each of these graphs is oligotrophic. The teal blue middle from 10 to 30 is mesotrophic, and 30 and above is the lesser quality. So you can see how our trending still is right on the edge between oligotrophic and mesotrophic at the 10 to 12 phosphorus units. The nice thing is we've seen a little downturn. So maybe some of the work we've done, the do-it-yourself stuff's happening. I think Seymour had some of that plateau in theirs as well.
Okay, I think we should move on to the next section. We have Glenn Swartz and myself who are going to be talking about the implementation phase for LWAPs. So let me share my screen and bring up Glenn's talk. Okay, Glenn, I think you should be able to go ahead. I'll scroll this as needed.
Okay, Dave, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Glenn Schwartz. I'm president of the Elmore Lake Association. And I'm going to follow up on a lot of the previous speakers' comments and kind of put the whole thing together with a timeline for Lake Elmore with our watershed assessment. So I'm just going to walk through this and see if you have any questions. But Lake Elmore is a 205-acre lake with a watershed of approximately 8.4 square miles. The Lake Elmore Association first met to discuss the possibility of an action plan with Peter Danford of the Lamoille County Conservation District in November of 2018, and has continued to be involved in every step of the process. A grant application was submitted in March of 2019 to fund the assessment. The grant was awarded in December of 2019. As you can see, some of the previous speakers here, but Fitzgerald Environmental began performing a detailed assessment between June of 2019 and August of 2019. The assessment yielded a total of 66 issues, of which 29 were identified as high to moderate projects. The Watershed Action Plan was completed in August of 2020, and the plan included a project priority list and a 30% design of the highest priority projects. And of course, I think somebody else mentioned this, but here we are right in the middle of COVID when this is happening. So things slowed down a little bit, but from 2020 to 2021, the Lamoille County Conservation District was granted program development funds by the National Resource Conservation Council, the NRCC, to identify projects to pursue for design and implementation based off of the Lake Elmore Watershed Action Plan and town and landowner feedback. From 2022 to 2023, funds were procured through various DEC clean water programs to complete 3 full designs and 1 preliminary design. In 2024, LCCD hopes to bring at least 2 of these projects to implementation. Bottom line, this is not a quick process. In our case, it took 6 years from inception to initial implementation. So as Peter said earlier, 5 years, we're looking at close to 6 years, but we did have COVID in there. So as far as lessons to be learned, all I can say is be patient. Even though the process will take a long time, the end result of water quality improvements in your lake will be worth the effort. So a little history there, but it takes a long time, and we hope to implement a couple of these projects the summer of this year. So I'll let Dave go, and then if anybody has questions, we can go from there.
All right, so let me bring up my slides. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Watershed Action Plan implementation for the Lake Dunmore and Fern Lake Watershed Action Plan. In our case, we had a concern, the Water Quality Committee, about the increasing phosphorus levels in 2018, 2019, and we brought this to our board and actually convinced them to self-fund a watershed action plan. And that plan identified over 60 projects, and you can see the type of project in the bar chart on the right, and which of those projects, or how many of those projects, were high priority. Okay. So here is a map of the two lakes and all of the projects. And the ones with the red triangles are high priority projects. And the table beneath the map shows the projects that are ongoing at the moment. So one advantage of self-funding this, I think, was that we were able to start very quickly on some of these projects. And but you'll see in my following slides, it's a lot of work. So any case, we selected the projects basically as they were prioritized in the Watershed Action Plan. And we identified many sources of funding and applied and were granted awards for these projects. And you can see on the right sort of the time scale for completion of the projects. So I just have a list here of the various tasks involved once you get a watershed action plan. And these tasks are, in our case, performed by our Water Quality Committee. As you've heard, in most cases, this is done by another organization, a regional conservation district or a clean water service provider. But what they have to do is select the potential projects from the Lake Watershed Action Plan. In our case, as I mentioned, we did this based on the prioritization in the plan and also based on landowner willingness to proceed. Then you have to go to the landowners and gain support for the project implementation and maintenance. And often this is, you have to do this a couple of times, show them the concept, show them the final design, talk about maintenance access in the future. You have to identify potential funding sources, and speaking with the basin planner can really help you here. And also, I think speaking early with the administrator of the grant from the funding institution about the suitability of the project, even before you complete the application, is a good idea. Then you have to complete the application, including a work plan, a budget, and a schedule. And this, requires input from a consultant who can provide cost and schedule estimates for these projects. And then if you're successful in an award, you have to negotiate a contract with that administrator. Then you have to hire a consultant to complete the design, obtain the permits, and oversee the implementation. And in some cases, this may require open competitive procurement process. Then you need to schedule and attend site visits with the consultant to prepare for the final design. And often this involves the landowner as well. Completing this list, you have to work with a consultant to develop the maintenance and operations plan and obtain a landowner's signatures on maintenance and operation access agreements. You have to keep the grant administrators informed of changes in scope and cost and schedule. And you have to then, once you have a design complete, you have to hire a contractor to implement the design And again, this may involve a competitive procurement. You have to, once the project's complete, you have to document that completion with photos, et cetera. You have to fulfill any commitments that you've made in your contract or signage or project maintenance. You know, in our case, we made some signs informing the public about why we did it and what we hope to accomplish. We have to submit periodic progress reports, typically quarterly, to the funding administrator. And you know, in most cases, these are contract reimbursement, or I should say, reimbursement contracts, where in our case, our association paid for these professional services and submitted invoices for reimbursement. And then you have to submit a final report. So what lessons have we learned in this process? Well, we've learned that it's wise to choose projects that were high priority in your plan and where you have landowner buy-in. We've found that our award success rate has been high. At least at present, the funding agencies are looking for good projects, and there seems to be enough money to go around, in my perception. Phosphorus reduction potential is, you know, a key metric. As I mentioned, keeping the basin planner in the loop is very helpful, particularly at the beginning. And landowner engagement is essential. You have to, you know, you don't want to spend a lot of time developing a project and find out that the landowner is having second thoughts or whatever. You want to keep them involved as the designs are evolving, so that they know what's going on and they feel like they have a say, which they do. And often we find that these landowner inputs result in more efficient designs because they're very much aware of what's going on. And obviously you need to work with them in scheduling implementation. I would also advise an early assessment of permitting with regulators. We had completed the final design on one of our projects when we learned that we needed to do a historical preservation assessment. And that actually delayed us more than almost a year in completion of that project. So, you know, once a 30% design is complete, you should be in good shape to secure any needed permits, but you need to work with the regulators to be sure that's the case. And then, you know, we've had several cases where there have been changing cost estimates or schedules, and you have to keep the funding administrators well informed on these to avoid surprises and to maintain and build trust. So I think with that, I'll just show you, this is that project on the Magoon boat launch again. This was our first major construction project that we completed about a year ago. And with that, I think I'll stop and we can begin questions.
Allison had a comment, a really good comment, and Allison?
You mean the response to Ken's question?
Yeah, just about the VDHP.
Ken asked about the historic assessments when DEC proposes those be completed, and he was building off a question that Caroline asked earlier. So DEC in our funding world, we require the initial VDHP screening, which is basically like a 2-page application at the 30% design stage for all lakeshore projects. And then if that review determines a full archaeological review, then that needs to happen during the final engineering design stage before implementation. So that is all laid out in the clean water funding protocol. And so I was just answering that question.
Okay, and then Perry Thomas, did you want to? Oh, go ahead, Susan. You're muted.
So Dave, do you think a lot of the work would have been lessened had you not gone about doing this yourself as an association, funding it from the start? Or do you think that the majority of the work was really after the 30% design for the projects were implemented, and kind of, if you were to have gone through DEC, that money would have been, I mean, they would have been done with that part of the project? Because it sounds like there's a lot of work here for the association.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the work has to be done by somebody, obviously, and I think in most cases it's done by the conservation district, and for most of the lakes that have been gone through this process. I think one advantage, if you have an enthusiastic group of people in your association of doing it yourself, is that you have full control over prioritization. You can work on whatever time scale you can manage. So there is that.
Yeah, I think in our case, the conservation district has done most of the work. We've worked with them all along the way. But the funding, they've chased the funding and they've done all that. So our lake association hasn't put out any money ahead of being reimbursed.
Thanks.
I think Perry Thomas had a comment on Stu's presentation that we missed.
I was just thanking Stu and everyone for the hard work, and it's wonderful to hear about property owner cooperation in the watershed. That's very promising. Thank you.
And just pointing out that Sarah Damsel has put some funding opportunity information in the chat in case you guys aren't monitoring it.
Yeah, and Sarah was very instrumental in bringing our Lake Watershed Action Plan to final report. Thank you, Sarah.
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was fabulous. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up? Again, I'm Pat Swazi. I'm the president of FOVLAP. And I'd just say a couple words. But that was great. My home lake is one of the 90% almost done. In fact, we're going to be meeting over the draft report on Friday. So I was making some notes now about thinking about, okay, now we have to move on. Now we got to get ready for implementation. So this was super helpful. And if folks are just starting out or just thinking about it, it's been a great exercise. I think well worth doing. It's really given us some perspective on where we need to go next. So thank you, everybody. I want to thank all our speakers, Allison, Evan Fitzgerald, and Frank, Lauren, Peter Danforth, Stu, and Dave Johnson and Glenn Schwartz. This was really excellent. I'd also want to thank the folks who helped get this organized, Dave Johnson and Jack Widnes, who Jack chairs our AIS Water Quality Committee. Dave, of course, is on the board, our treasurer. Does many, many things. Thank you, Lisa Baroud, for monitoring the chat and dealing with the questions. Thank you, Susan Gresser, for keeping everybody on time. Very much appreciated. Again, thanks to the events committee chaired by Jackie Sprague, and of course the AIS Water Quality Committee chaired by Jack Widnes. So this was great. I want to remind everybody, when you click leave the meeting, the final survey will pop up. It'll just take a minute, but we really appreciate it if you would respond to that. And Dave mentioned that the presentations will be on our website in a few days, and we'll also post the video of this event, and that will be accessible through the website sometime in the next week. might be in a few days. And, it just takes us a little while to get everything put together and get it on the website. So once again, thank you. There are more FOVLAP events coming up, and do mark your calendars for the first Friday of June when we have our all-day lake seminar, and we'll be announcing that topic very, very soon. So once again, we will close the meeting now. Thank you very much, everybody.